Great, welcome to the State of Us. My name is Ed Whitelaw from the Real Ideas organisation based here in Plymouth and across the Southwest. And it is my great pleasure to be your co-host and co-chair for this afternoon's session with my fantastic colleague, Frances.
Hey, everybody. Thanks, Ed. I mean to feel like we're presenting some sort of like this morning, like we should have a spin-off maybe. I'm getting quite...
Let's do it.
But yeah, hi, I'm Frances Northrop. I work for the New Economics Foundation, and I've been delighted to be part of hosting and organising these sessions. It's been really amazing. We're really grateful to Power to Change for funding them, and this has been a 4-conference series. So what we wanted was originally to have a whole day together, but obviously that wasn't possible. So we've staggered them over the last few weeks, which I know a lot of you have joined us for. And this is the final one, an extended one with some special guests. And we'll be exploring in this how we build powerful communities and economic democracy inspired by these ideas of new municipalism. And I'm really delighted to welcome our speakers today. We've got Tobele Chittenden from Makers Value Partnership in Johannesburg, Elena Tarifa from Barcelona on Camus, Carly Okuno from Cooperation Jackson in Mississippi, and Matthew Thompson from Liverpool University, which we wanted that to reflect how important the international solidarity of this work is, and that we're really, really grateful to have you with us today. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you, Frances. Before we go on, usual little bits of sort of instructions and etiquette about how things are going to work. We have a slightly fuller agenda this afternoon, which I've dropped into the chat, which you can see for yourself. And as with sort of preceding events, today is split over 2 parts. Initially, we will hear from our speakers. We'll then have a chance to discuss amongst ourselves in breakouts, which will then be followed by a final panel Q&A with our fantastic guests. We will be recording the event as a record, but also that will be included. We'll include recording in the breakout rooms as well. The hashtag for the event is also in the chat. That is the State of Us 2021. Please make use of that. You will notice that you are all on mute. We will, of course, unmute you for the breakout rooms because we really, really want to hear from you all. The State of Us, like any conference, is about making connections. So please, if you are happy, introduce yourself by dropping your name into the chat and even talk about, maybe mention where you're from. Do also share your email, of course, only if you are happy to do so. Please do ask questions of our speakers. You can do this by dropping them in the chat, and we'll put as many of them as we can to our speakers. We will have 5 minutes for questions after each speaker. Please do put your questions in the chat, and then there'll be a Q&A with our speaker panel at the end. We do really want to hear from you, but if we can ask you to try and keep questions as concise as possible and avoid sort of wider, more rambling comments. Speakers, you can obviously have you have the power to unmute yourselves, but please only do this to present or address a specific question. So today kind of marks the end of the beginning of our final, it's the final summative session of the State of Us conference series, and where we've kind of sought to sort of unpack these ideas that Frances talked about, community power, economic democracy, new municipalism, and ask what next for places like Plymouth here in the UK. Plymouth is a fantastic city. We have a celebrated cooperative community business and social enterprise sector, the UK's first social enterprise city with so many great people doing really, really great things. But what next? There's so much more to do, and a sense that nationally and even more locally, now dark clouds are starting to gather. In trying to answer this, we've explored the state of work. How are people building power within and beyond the workplace? We've been to the state of spaces and places and seen how groups are creating greater economic control in the high streets, parks and green spaces. We looked at the state of resilience, how communities are building power and economic democracy, but also tackling the big issues of climate change and ecological breakdown. I've certainly found this a hugely sort of educational experience, and it's really helped me in terms of move some of my thinking on. But rather than share some of my reflections, I'm keen to hear from some of our State of Us partners who have been with us on the journey. Gareth, you're the chair of the Plymouth Social Enterprise Network, and I don't know, what are your key reflections on the event so far, and what do we need to do next to keep building community power and economic democracy?
Well, thanks, Ed. Big question. Yeah, so it's been a really interesting series of events. I think there's some really the learning I've taken from this, and some of the sort of phrases and language has been really interesting. One of the real sort of things for me is about building alliances within this sort of wider movement of cooperatives, social enterprises, unions, transition towns. We've done that quite a lot in the Southwest to some degree, with some success, but it strikes me as a classic problem of progressive politics, you know, from the Spanish Civil War to elections right now. We're too divided. We fight amongst ourselves for who's purer than purer, and that's a problem. And we've seen with recent elections, we've got to come together with a really clear offer to sort of tackle, you know, some of this government stuff. And that's one thing I've taken. The idea of these political realities and the need to be savvy with language that resonates and tactical, I think is really important about some of that as well, and strategic. I think one of the issues I'm interested about all these different policy brands. So we've got the government talking about levelling up, and they've stolen the language of Build Back Better. You've got municipalism, community wealth building, inclusive growth, inclusive economy, all these policy brands and these definitions of these things. Oh, what do they all mean? It's really, sometimes that language is quite challenging, but these concepts and words deeply matter. So I think getting that right, I think is really, really interesting. And I really like the idea about this, when do we work with the state or beyond the state or against the state? That came across in some presentations, someone from London, really powerfully against the state. It's really interesting. But what we've proved in Plymouth is that by working with the state and with a really motivated council, we've actually achieved quite a lot around this sort of new economy, another brand, stuff in Plymouth around the social enterprise. So that's some of my my takeaways from this.
Great, thank you, Gareth. Something really important about language there. I want to go to Indra. You're from the Alternative UK and a long-standing friend of the city. What are your reflections, and what do we need to do to keep this all growing and going?
Yeah, thanks very much, Ed and Gareth. I mean, I agree with Gareth's call, but I think I would put the emphasis a bit more on the autonomy and the self-reliance of the people coming together in the face of an old system that, let's face it, has led us into this mess that we're in. So that doesn't mean dismissing the current power structure, but grounding our own vision for the future sufficiently to know that the partner state is not keeping us sort of supplicant. I would say over this past 3 sessions, I've heard at least 4 distinct voices, 4 different kinds of languages that show a variety of kinds of agency, but clearly share a vision for place-based community flourishing. So those 4 voices would be the entrepreneurial voice, the sort of civic bureaucratic voice, which is possibly more to do with funders. There's an activist voice, you know, which is focused on social justice. But there's also a 4th voice, which I'm struggling to really name, but it's sort of, you know, maybe more feminine, creative and storytelling voice. And we need to focus on weaving these things together, as you've managed to do in this event, as a kind of ecology of activity that knows it's working together well towards the same goal. And the 2 things that I believe would help that happen is firstly to build some sort of container to hold these diverse voices together and in constant dialogue with each other. People need something to belong to, they need a place to meet diversity and learn from each other and share their resources. So can we design something that would recognize the mutual dependence of, for example, Fab Labs with Stiltskin Soapbox Theatre that everyone can belong to? And the second thing is I would create a media system that can really, in a complex way, reflect back to the people what they are doing across Plymouth. Something I would say like the Daily Alternative for Plymouth.
Fantastic. Thanks, Indra. Yeah, a really interesting challenge of sort of what is the container for so many diverse views and voices, how do we bring all that together. Finally, I wanted to come to Nick, who's kind of been our in-house academic and spirit guide to the state of us. What are your takeaways and thoughts on where we need to go next with some of this?
Thanks, Matt. I just wanted to step back briefly and reflect on a couple of the sort of political tensions there seem to be on the one hand between the goals of community power and economic democracy, and to be blunt, the goals of the current government, who, lest we need reminding, are riding high at the moment and quite at liberty to drive on with their agenda. So in terms of the tensions, we're likely to continue to be travelling along a road in terms of a country which is about centralising government power and control, privatising public infrastructure, and also unfortunately dividing and rule by scapegoating many people, black and brown people, poor people, indeed large sections of the organised left. So in this context, it's in this context of these events, it's been incredibly inspiring to have an alternative to that starting to be presented, and it leaves you really hopeful that the new municipalism is being more debated, more involved in, invested in than ever in the UK, but also leaves me a little bit concerned about how it further develops. So up until now, it seems it's been developing largely alongside or sometimes under the radar of the sort of dominant political conditions that we're living in right now. But going forward, I wonder whether it needs to, and this is a question, whether it needs to more explicitly articulate what its alternative to the dominant government agendas are. So, i.e., is it, more clearly perhaps that it's for more collective forms of ownership in the face of privatisation, more local democratisation and against centralisation, and for greater community involvement by confronting racism and inequality head on at very local and granular level. So these are just sort of three of the sort of tensions and key sort of sites of struggle out of which the new municipalism is going to emerge if it's going to be successful, even more successful in the years ahead. That hopefully we can talk more about some of these and other tensions as part of today.
Fantastic. Thank you, Nick. Really great to hear your thoughts. So, I mean, over the last few weeks, we've seen a range of examples of new municipalist ideas in practice, communities creating everyday democracy, dual power and trans-local organising. Today, we're going to hear from a few folks who've been building community power in very different places around the world, and in cases of taking this a few steps further, deciding to organise to support and stand their own municipal local government candidates and winning elections. Is this where we need to be going? This is what we need to be doing more here in the UK, or are there other more economic approaches to community power? Frances, back to you.
Yeah, so I think that we often kind of mix, it's a false divide between the economy and community, and that really what we're told is the economy is something that's big and it's over there and it's corporations and it's not for us, and that actually we are an intrinsic part of the economy. It's how we define what that economy is, and that some of that's informal, some of that's paid. And so that's why I'm really interested to hear from our speakers today, because I think you each reflect kind of different aspects of that and can kind of show how people are building power in different ways. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to our first speaker, which is Tobele from Makers Valley in Johannesburg. Hey, nice to see you.
Hey, nice to see you all. Thank you so much for having me. I'm just going to quickly share my screen. Just hold on a sec. Okay, cool. It's sharing. Thank you. Like I said, for having me. I am really, really just intrigued by this conversation and the variety of people that are on this panel. I feel like I'm learning a lot. So it's awkward to be a speaker when I'm actually understanding this concept with fresh eyes. I think Ed was the first one to ever speak about new municipalism to me. And I just thought, hey, this is actually what we are doing in our community. So actually, Frances had mentioned that I'm from South Africa. I'm in Johannesburg. And yeah, I wanted to paint a picture of what South Africa is like and why there's been a need for what we are doing in our community. And South Africa in 1994 had a dawn of new hope. It was a historical year because it was our first time that Black and African people had an opportunity to vote. And yeah, what was a promise of transformation and completely, new hope for our country, 27 years later is not the case. And there's a real sense of disappointment, frustration, and anger in South Africa currently, and like a real sense of actually, why are we waiting and why are we relying on the government to provide change that they've promised over these 27 years when it hasn't even come to fruition. And a big thing that we found is that there are huge inequalities in South Africa. I think South Africa is one of the most unequal societies in the world. And if you look at that, you see literally, if you come and look at a demarcation or a map of South Africa, you can actually see the inequalities in their different areas, because that's how society was divided in apartheid. So you actually see the inequality. If you are from a poor society, across the road, you see Sandton City, which is completely different living standards to your own. And it really causes this anger and sense of frustration, and what we think also obviously high levels of crime. So in South Africa, I think we were in the New Mayo Crime Index for 2021, we were actually the third most dangerous country in the world. And the biggest thing, the overall consensus in terms of the biggest crime in the categories, the biggest crime category for us was greed, well, related to corruption and bribery. And that has been, I think, the pet peeve of us South African citizens, because the government that came into power, that promised the world, that represented us as a people, majority Black and African people, have been the very same people to steal from us, to take what we were promised into their own hands and into their own homes and into their own pockets. And so the cycle of greed and corruption has really brought a really negative light in terms of our government at the moment. So yeah, we are frustrated and angry. That's all I can say about this slide. And so there's a real sense of urgency for change. What has been also very disappointing is that when COVID-19 came into the picture, it was an opportunity for our government to really put in new policies, because clearly the policies over the 27 years, the conservative macroeconomic policies that have been in place were clearly not working. And so we saw this as an opportunity for change. We saw this as an opportunity to strengthen social security. And unfortunately, instead of that, actually under investigation currently 10.5 billion rand of COVID fraud and corruption is underway in our country. So they're really, I can't stress enough how angry people are and how, not trusting of the government we are. And even with the vaccinations coming to roll out soon in our country, that they've just started with the over 60-year-olds, there is huge mistrust. And also just, very skeptical about how it's going to be rolled out. Are people going to make this, make money off of this? So it really has put a real spanner into the works of our country, which is disappointing, because in our community, we've seen COVID really bring us together and spark some creativity and innovation, which I'll share with you just now. So yes, a bit about us and our organization. We are the Makers Valley Partnership, and we actually met Ed, I think it's 2 years ago now, and we had done this exchange program to understand what was happening in Plymouth and how we could also possibly replicate or strengthen what we were doing in our community. So we've always believed that creative and social entrepreneurship is a driving force for our community, and Johannesburg is, we call for short Jozi, and it's a real hub of entrepreneurship. It's a real place of urbanization. Our community, I think, is really special and unique because it's so diverse. We call it a little melting pot of Africa, because you'll find every ethnicity, every race, every culture, religion in this area that we've called the Makers Valley. And so this is kind of our mandate. We want to enable the Makers Valley neighborhood towards a well-being economy through social and creative entrepreneurship development. And I think why I wanted to mention the fact that we've called it this ourselves, it's not a government name. We kind of mobilize the community together to say, how can we create a vision? We've been impoverished for way too long. The promises of government haven't come to our community, and how can we activate change for ourselves? And so a series of dialogues and conversations with our community came about, and the name Makers Valley came to being. And essentially it is because we believe we are a community of makers, obviously a very creative community, but also change makers. And we actually located in a valley, literally, with the Yokske River, a very important river in South Africa, running through our community. So I think that was one of the biggest things, is that mobilizing a community for a shared vision was something that I felt really ties into the theme of this, because without that, there wouldn't have been this unity and this drive, this active participation amongst our community members for something more. And so even though we didn't have the actual aspects of what it is, just having this vision of what we wanted to see in our community really got the community together, and then started to think about what are the ways that we're going to do this. And so, yeah, I've put the SDGs here because it's kind of a global thing. Obviously, I don't think it's really relevant. Everything is relevant to our context, but I thought it would give you a picture of how we're driving societal change in our community, because it's something that everyone understands. But essentially, we have said is that we want our community to empower change. We're not going to wait for anyone to come and save the day. How can everyone in our community be active participants for change? And we thought this is best through social entrepreneurship and obviously creative entrepreneurship. We have a huge youth population in our country, and we really believe that if we can give them a sense of ownership, they would stay in the community, because what happens is, especially in our community, they will always look for greener pastures. As soon as they've, had high school or they go into tertiary, they move on into a different place where there's greener pastures. But we found with this model of mobilizing social entrepreneurship and saying, hey, you've got amazing ideas for societal issues that you yourself has experienced in this community. Why don't we provide a platform for you to come up with this, to incubate you, to develop your enterprise, your social entrepreneurship model that will address a societal need that you yourself have faced and you're obviously passionate about. And what we've started to see is that because there's that investment, instead of you just going to an NGO, because that's how majority of our nonprofits in South Africa work, is that they will say, we address the specific SDG and you come to us in order to make the change, come and volunteer with us. Whereas we're saying, no, you have the idea, you have the vision, you have the experience, you are on the ground. We can help you create this enterprise, which will not only address the social issue, but also be sustainable, give you an income to obviously live and in the community, but also entice you not to leave. And so we're reducing that cycle of poverty. So we're really excited about that. And obviously a big issue in South Africa, I think it's one of the highest, is I think it's 46.2% at the moment, unemployment in South Africa at the moment. So that's a huge, huge, huge issue. And in our community, it's, we've got 56% of our community, specifically the youth population, that are unemployed. So yes, jobs are needed, and we look to corporates and the government to create that, but we really believe that the social entrepreneurs in our community, if they can generate an income for themselves and be sustainable enough, they can start to also create jobs and employment further down the line. So this is just an example of some of the social enterprises that are under our umbrella, the Makers Valley. We've got various different types that address various issues, like you can see, and I'll go into some examples just now, but that's just to say, as Makers Valley Partnership, we don't just look at one specific SDG, we are mobilizing the community to activate them. Yeah, and then I mentioned that COVID-19 came about. So we were doing this before. We were doing incubation programs, development programs. We have a donated space in the community, which acts as a hub for entrepreneurship. It's where we do programming, where we have connect sessions, poetry events, etc. But because of COVID, we saw that a lot of this wasn't able to take place. And so we really had to connect with our community again to understand what are the most pressing needs. And I think, when I spoke about the government just going completely, like revealing their true character through COVID, COVID also revealed the true character of our community, which was beautiful because it gave us a sense of togetherness, is what we would say in South Africa. It's a very slang word for this sense of let's do this together. And we went to over 2,000 households, knocking on the doors. Even though the police came and stopped us, we had to ask and understand what is happening in your household, who has been affected by job losses, how many people are relying on you and your income. So we just did a little bit of a survey to understand the most pressing needs. And it tied into some of these trends that we saw globally, that businesses, incubators and accelerators weren't really what was needed at the moment. Regenerators was something that we needed to do, because these organizations or enterprises that we had just incubated and had gone through seed funding, etc., actually when COVID broke, had to use that income to just survive. So because all the opportunities of market access to market were kind of hindered because of COVID, they really asked us for ways that we can help regenerate their business. How do they get to where they were before? And then we also realized that we needed to become more self-reliant and resilient. And I think that was crucial for us because there is this kind of narrative in South Africa, because the government had promised, that we are waiting on government. And that's why I keep saying that a sense of agency is something that we really promote in Makers Valley, to say, actually, let's not wait. And we've even had to rethink how we brand ourselves, because we wear these yellow t-shirts and everything in South Africa is like a political party is going to come and save the day. They saw our yellow t-shirts in the community and they thought we were the next political party. And we had to completely like combat that thinking, because we are saying, no, we don't have the answers. We want to help you find the answers yourselves. And so this aspect of being resilient, coming up with solutions for ourselves, has been a very new concept, but very exciting to see it unfold. And then obviously urban farming is something that has a low hanging fruit. It's something that you would expect Africans to be doing, but very interesting how we have become very westernized, even in our consumption in South Africa and in Johannesburg specifically. And so things that were perhaps normal for us 50, to 100 years ago have become very foreign. And so this concept of urban farming has been reintroduced into the community, and gogos and the elder community have really also found their place where they've felt kind of not useful. This COVID kind of mobilization has brought in every single person from our community, whether you're old or young, coming together once again to think of solutions. And urban farming was such a beautiful one, where we see the elderly come back and share their knowledge, their African wisdom in terms of what to plant and not to. So yeah, my last slide, which is not clicking, oh, there we go, is just a picture of the various initiatives, and I'll deep dive into some of them just now. But one of the solutions that came up was we were doing soup kitchens, which were your traditional soup kitchens, everyone coming to a center where the meals were provided and cooked, queues and queues of people, again, cops coming to stop what we're doing. But interestingly enough, the community just supported us all the way. And eventually we identified 6 community kitchen champions who said, this is not sustainable. Let us as community heroes who are known and trusted in the community take on a portion of what you're doing. And so we have now diverted, instead of us having the soup kitchen run centrally, we have now pockets of these community kitchens run by mamas, again, people that were not working, just sitting in the community, who are now cooking and serving their community. But not only that, they're looking at it as a social enterprise for themselves. So we mobilized assets for them, but now these 6 kitchens are going through training and understanding what entrepreneurship is all about. Tuesdays and Thursdays, they cook for the community, but on the other days, they use those assets, their pots, their pans, their gas stoves, to have mobile kitchens, to cook at weddings, for example, and funerals, to go into markets, etc. And so, yeah, it's a very grassroots kind of intervention, but I think it's been amazing to see people that were unemployed find use for themselves, but also find use for their community as well. So they've been incredible. And what we're doing with the community kitchens is really just thinking about how we can also create this circular economy. So looking at ways that the surplus food or the food waste that is generated, potato peels, etc., can go into a mini biogas digester, and that fuels the gas that they need then to cook the meals. So we're always looking at little solutions around that, but also because these solutions are quite new, it's also educating our community at the same time. The other example, which is over here, is our community recycling project. So recycling is a very, very I mean, in our community is a concept that don't even know what recycling means. So you'll find in the north, in the more suburban areas, obviously the white communities do recycle, but Black people just in African communities don't really understand the concept. However, this was an assumption that we thought wouldn't work, and we did a 2-week pilot to see if the community would be mobilized in that direction. And this came from one local creative waste management company, young couple in their 20s thinking, can we mobilize the community to recycle? Because us as a creative waste management company can use that waste, obviously when they go back to the buyback centers and sell it in quantities and in bulk, they benefit you know, for their business, but also they can use those items to create products, to do educational programs and workshops with kids, etc. So they are one of the social enterprises that we had worked with and partnered with and incubated in Makers Valley, but then they are from the community and live there and said, hey, we've got this idea. So eventually printed out this flyer with, I don't know how many languages, it was 11, I think, 11 languages, because I've explained our community is very diverse, to explain this concept of recycling. And what we're finding now, to cut a long story short, is that 350 people currently are recycling every single week, 3 times a week. And it sounds small, but it's incredible. And as more people understand the concept and see what it looks like, more people are doing it. But in addition to that, we've now started a community swap shop where when you recycle and bring your bag of recyclable items, you get a point, which we call an MVP, and you can access surplus food. So a big thing in South Africa, 3 billion tons of food is wasted every single year. And we then work with various organizations that divert the food to our community, and our community can access that food through recycling. So it goes back into this active participation thing, not just lining up in a queue and waiting for food, but a more dignified experience where people are acting and really being participatory in uplifting the community and earning food in return. So it's been an interesting concept. We've got lots of learnings, but what we found is that people actually prefer to go to the recycling swap shop than to a community kitchen and line up to get a meal. They get to choose what they want at the shop. They can choose maize, they can choose whatever items they need. It also further reduces food waste because they're actually taking items that they want and need for their household. And so it's been such a beautiful picture of how something that we might think only works in one context and something that we thought actually wouldn't be possible has been incredible because it's spoken to the direct needs of our community. So it's been amazing to see that. The other things that we do is obviously the space that I've mentioned is our hub, and that's where our community members can come, feel safe to think of new ideas, to see how it can benefit the community, and then go through a development program of making this an actual enterprise. So that hub is really starts from a grassroots level to ensure that we are helping people with digital literacy. How do you turn a computer on? How do you read emails, et cetera, et cetera? And then we can get to a point of what is enterprise development really. But yes, there are so many different change makers in our community, and I could share a list of them. But I think what stands out for me and what I wanted to share is that because we have this range of diverse minds, young and old, obviously various ethnicities and religions, all coming together because of this thing that has impacted us all equally, we've come into think of solutions together. And so Makers Valley Partnership, especially when Ed came about 3 years ago, you know, we're working with various pockets and, you know, some change makers that we had identified. But what we've started to see is this momentum build and kind of a ripple effect of more people wanting to get involved, more people understanding this concept of, hey, actually, I can do something and not just sit at home. We have this concept, well, we call it sit at home concept because that is just what our community has been faced with, because they haven't had anything that they know what to do. They haven't had the steps of how do I address the situation in my community. And so, yeah, the civic education part of it, of who are you? What is your vision for this community? Why do you feel like you belong in this community? I think has been such a great conversation to have, and it's really been kind of unpacked during COVID-19, when people have got to see the real, raw, honest situations of their neighbors. So yeah, that's just a glimpse of our community. I don't know if I've made you a little bit more confused than you started, but I think I just wanted to paint a picture of the things that are taking place. I know we only had 10 minutes, but I'd love to hear your questions if you have. Thank you,
Tobele. That's an amazing, very quick skip through what looks like an incredible project. I just, before we open it up to the floor, I just wanted to ask you a little bit about the premises and the land that you've got. Do you own that?
No, we don't. So yeah, to give you a little bit of context, so Makers Valley is an area of about 5 communities or 5 areas in the map, and it's about maybe a 5-kilometer radius, essentially. In the center of that, we do have some stakeholders that were very surprising to be there in the first place, because the area that we're in is a very impoverished area. Nothing happens there, but Nando's are a big stakeholder there, and they chose that area because yeah, they've got a lot of the Nando's maybe 20 years ago started in that area and built they built their culture of Nando's and their restaurants from that area specifically. So they are a big stakeholder there, and they've got their head office there. And Victoria Yards is a fairly new development which started 6 years ago, and they are based in this community as well. And it is this relationship with Victoria Yards that has kind of put us in this community as Makers Valley Partnership. Victoria Yards is a establishment for artisans. You have a workshop / retail space, and it's really a creative entrepreneurial kind of like gem in the city. And what's amazing about the relationship with Victoria Yards is that they've donated a space, because this concept of gentrification is something that we are exploring and navigating. And how do we do this without the displacement of the people in the community? So we have in South Africa, well, specifically and very close to us, an example of what had happened maybe 10 years ago of gentrification, and very exciting, but actually just completely 10 years later, we see the effects of how the community was completely left to ruin in that area. It's called Maboneng. And we didn't want to repeat what had happened there. And so Makers Valley Partnership has kind of stood in that gap to say, how can we help? Because if you walk around and do the survey, everyone in this community wants to see improvement. They want to see potholes being repaired. They want to see street lights being installed. They want to have access to Wi-Fi. So how do we improve the community without driving up property prices, making sure that the community is involved every single step of the way? And so that's been our role as Makers Valley Partnership, to ensure that the community have a say in what happens in their area.
Thank you. Yeah, no, it's such an issue. I'm sure other speakers will talk about the, adding value to landowners' land, and aiding gentrification is such a tension. There's a few more questions from the chat. So one was, are people able to become members of Makers Valley?
So yeah, this is something that we have been exploring, and I know there's some other models that work with membership. We are in June actually going to have a membership, but it's for free. We are looking at ways that we can generate income ourselves as an organization, but we don't believe that paying for a membership is possible in the context that we're in, and it would just create barriers. So a membership that does give you the feeling that you're part of this community, that you have access to these newsletters, etc. So creating that community aspect, but not actually a paid for membership, is what we'll be launching in June.
Thank you. And the other two questions I think we can probably put together, which is really that, well, have you been allowed to sort of get on with it, or are you seen as a threat? But also, have you been politically active? So
we haven't been politically active. We only registered formally as a non-profit last year, so we are fairly new to the game, and it's not something that we wanted to participate in. Like I mentioned, people are looking at us as a political party, and that's not the place that we wanted. However, we've almost by default started to play in this space, and it's because of the need and people looking to us to play that part. And it's actually a very interesting thing that we're navigating as an organization at the moment. I don't have an actual answer, but I think what we know is that we want to create citizens that are active for themselves. So this dependency notion we want to throw out the window and say, hey, you don't have to rely on anyone to see this happen to your community. And that's kind of the narrative that we've been sticking to. What was the other question? I think I missed the first part of it.
Sort of more, have you been allowed to get on with it, sort of?
Oh, yes. So it's been interesting because, like I mentioned, we were faced with a lot of opposition, specifically at the beginning of COVID. What was interesting is that, because of the corruption, our community never saw the food parcels or the PPE or anything that was promised by government that was supposed to come into our community. However, we were still faced with opposition. So people are hungry and starving and didn't have anywhere to go, but there was nowhere else to go. And so we really just carried on. We spoke to the various parties, and I think what was taking place in South Africa, it's not just our community. We started to see other communities struggling with the same issues. And so we then formed and got part of what we call the community action networks, which really peaked during COVID. And as a kind of movement of community action networks, we started to be able to put pressure on the various policies that we're putting into place around COVID and around how we respond, the legal entities that could intervene, et cetera. Actually, we started to see those structures weaken and more kind of freedom given to nonprofits during that time, which it hadn't started like that. But I think the community action networks, specifically in Cape Town and Johannesburg, really made an impact in that space.
Thank you so much, Tobele. There'll be a chance for people to go into the breakout rooms and think of other questions. And I know you're staying with us, aren't you? So we'll be able to ask questions later. Really, really, really appreciate that. Thank you so much. So I'm going to now lead on to Elena for your presentation, please. So that's Elena from Barcelona en Comú. Apologies for the pronunciation there with my very Yorkshire accent.
That's fine, Francis. So good afternoon, everybody. I'm really happy to be here, and thank you for the invitation to this plenary session of the State of Us. I think you have been through very interesting sessions these past days, and well, I hope we can share our experience as a citizen platform currently running the city of Barcelona, as most of you may know. And so I shall begin with, I have no slides to show, but of course, after my intervention, I can send you the presentation so you can have it all, you can share it. So I shall begin with the origins of Barcelona en Comú. So Barcelona en Comú didn't come out from nowhere. It all started in June 2014 when a group of people from the city's social movements, such as PA, the anti-mortgage platform, neighborhood activists, cooperative movements, came together to invite current progressive political movements and parties to join and present an alternative to bring back the city to their citizens for the upcoming municipal elections in May 2015. So in the years before its creation, in a context of economic and political crisis in which traditional political institutions were failing to respond to the needs of the people, a multitude of citizens' movements mobilized in the city and demonstrated the power of organized citizens to propose and implement solutions. Surely you may know Indignados, 15M, the anti-mortgage movement with PA, the anti-austerity movements, and so on. All had learned how to self-organize and campaign. So we took the social networks, we took the streets, but however, we found that change was blocked from above by the institutions. So the moment had arrived to take back the institutions and put them at the service of the common good. So we decided to win back the city to their citizens through Barcelona en Comú, a citizens platform led by activists and ordinary people. And we created then this new electoral platform with two big decisions. One was the idea of confluence. So we had social movements and civil organizations, plus involving some small and new political parties. Small means like the former, let's say, Communist Party and the Green Party, and of course Podemos, was at that moment also a new political party, and also plus individual citizens. So that was the confluence, which is the way to explain bottom-up and citizen leadership by putting the community, the common good, in the first place, all together under the same mark, Barcelona en Comú. So we were no longer from, for instance, Podemos or Iniciativa or Guanyem, which was the name of the citizen platform, Let's Win Barcelona, Guanyem Barcelona, but we were all from Barcelona en Comú, all with the same goal. And the second decision was to begin from the city, from the closest administrations to the people, the local one. So our strategy had been to start from below, from what we knew best, our streets, our neighborhoods. The proximity of municipal governments to the people make them the best opportunity we had to take the chance from the streets to the institution. So cities have always been a place of encounter, of exchange of ideas, of innovation. You can see that from, for instance, these days that you've been sharing a lot of interest in local initiatives. And cities are, when necessary, a place of revolution. So cities are where democracy was born, and they are and will be where we can start to recover it. Of course, there was also pragmatism and our desire to win. We thought that we had a better chance of winning with a bottom-up approach in our city. This bottom-up approach is what we call municipalism or neo-municipalism. And why do we believe municipalism is the best political strategy? So municipal level politics is the easier way for ordinary people to impact on shaping politics every day and everywhere. And municipalism has a greater potential in terms of deepening democracy and feminizing politics, an issue I'm going to talk about later, compared to the state level action. You know, states have been questioned by the citizens because they are not able to address current problems that we are facing, such as climate change, migration, refugee crisis, and so on. So municipalism allows us to act beyond the traditional theoretical and binary debates. We can discuss hard issues, but not all the time. It is time to work together towards concrete goals and solutions for people everyday problems, such as housing, tourism massification, city mobility, etc. At a local level, it is easier to create mechanisms of participation for our diverse population, to integrate migrant people, women, young people, older people, and join other people with similar motivation to change things. At the same time, we promote autonomy and participation, as we can open debates in the city. So this leads me to talk about how we have implemented innovation in citizens' participation, which I think is an interesting issue to share. So other ways of doing politics means listening, participating, and collaborating with civil society and what their demands are. So we have provided spaces of open participation since the very beginning, by presenting first the project in public meetings, in squares, in different neighborhoods across the city, and we still do so in the institution. For instance, during these last years, our mayor, Ada Colau, has been answering open neighborhood inquiries once every 2 Fridays, visiting all the Barcelona neighborhoods. Of course, this was after, before the pandemic, and now after the pandemic, she's beginning to visit 2 neighborhoods every week without being announced, because we think that being in the streets, it's the best way to know what's going on in the city, and not spending so much time in the office. So we also approved a new participatory municipal and district plan, which unfortunately has been turned down by the High Court of Justice, as it allowed the possibility of popular citizen initiatives, being the first one presented, the one asking to municipalize water supply in the city, which is not public management. And this, of course, was a big threat to the company actually in charge of the water supply. I was in Barcelona. And so that's why they appealed to the court. So this affected the whole participatory plan, which is on hold now. And then we have what we call e-democracy through the use of the online platform, Decidim Barcelona. So let's decide on Barcelona. And this is an open source traceable platform, which we have shared with other municipalities to be used, and that allowed to build our electoral program in a collaborative way, but it has especially been a tool for citizenship to decide on local policies. For instance, both individual citizens and organizations could introduce proposals for the municipal action plan and then vote for them. And now, in this moment, we have going on the first participatory budget process through it, where 30 million euros of the city investment can be directly decided by Barcelona citizens. And now we have 200 final projects, 20 for each district, and they will be finally voted this June. And of course, the projects, the final projects will be executed. So during this year and next year. But the Decidim, this platform, is mainly a platform that can be used to present citizen initiatives. So citizens can promote through the collection of signatures that the City Council carries out a certain action of collective interest, provided that it is within its powers. And several citizen platforms and organizations have driven public consultations, indeed, through this platform, as it is a tool open to anybody. Of course, we also use this platform for internal polls in our organization. We vote there important decisions related with the organization and with some important decisions in the institutions. For instance, we vote there if we shall be in a coalition with the Socialist Party, indeed, no? At the local government. So for us, winning back the city is about more than winning the local elections. It means putting a new transparent and participatory model of local government, which is under citizen control, into practice. It also means implementing fair, redistributive and sustainable policies to respond to the economic and political crisis. For us, the institution is a tool, not a goal in itself. The movement we've built, the communes, it is now more important than ever. So to put into practice a more participatory form of governance, to support the politics proposals made by the City Hall, to be outside the institution at the same time, which is a challenge, and to build our own discourse outside the institution. And so I'd like to briefly talk about the issue of feminization of politics. I know you may be interested in that because for us is a very important point. As Laura Perez, the 4th Lieutenant Mayor by Barcelona City Council and responsible of the feminist area at the council, says in the chapter Feminizing Politics through Municipalism from the Fearless Cities Guides, History show us that feminism is invariably brave and transformative. We must continually insist on the central importance of feminism and its teachings as a form of political practice, because this is a practical application of the old adage that without feminism, there can be no revolution. Without an intervention in daily life, in what is happening all the time, no real change is possible. So this is from the chapter of the Fearless Cities guide. So what is truly feminized politics for us? So for us, there are like 4 key points. The first basic condition of action is parity, of course, of men and women in the spaces where politics takes place. For example, our executive and administrative teams are collective and gender balanced, and the team that governs the city is 50% female. And so we try to promote gender balance and gender equality within the organization first. Second important point is that we believe that all voices should be heard. For us, this is very important for our really feminizing politics. So we try to develop more horizontal and democratic ways of organizing our meetings. For instance, this includes shorter speaking times, making sure it is not always the same people who speak, and ensuring that all decisions are taken collectively. And for instance, men tend to speak longer, so we give the floor alternatively to women, and we encourage their participation in all the meetings. This also means reconsidering who is an expert. For example, many of the people who participate in neighborhood assemblies understand the daily reality of their communities and have knowledge that is extremely important for those of us who are in elected office and want to design policies that work. It means paying attention to the relation and dimension of politics. So it means promoting teamwork, horizontality, participation, and power sharing. And it also means limiting confrontation, limiting abstract discourses, and also academicism. And of course, to allow change through the accumulation of small victories, allowing great political changes to be sustainable, and also by avoiding pessimism. Of course, this means inclusive speeches, listening and learning from the others. Empathy is an important word. And to know that what we share, aims, worldviews, as a starting point for dialogue, always. And a third important point for feminizing politics, it's working for a true sharing of responsibilities, political and personal, between men and women. And this is probably the most important, well, the most difficult task that we face. No? So we know domestic tasks and caring roles are distributed extremely unequal between women and men, which with most of them falling to women. So for instance, we try to avoid scheduling meetings at the end of the working day. We worked for the creation of spaces where children can be also present. We invest organizational funds in play areas and child-friendly zones. And of course, we also try to take advantage of the opportunities offered by tools for digital participation, which we have really developed during, of course, this pandemic, as it was the only tool for participation, indeed. And also we have a protocol for group treatment. This protocol will help us to avoid and to deal with any kind of harassment within the organization. And also it will be really focused on awareness and prevention, more than in punishing. So this is really something new that we have just approved within the organization. And the fourth key point is, of course, incorporating gender equality as a key point for all our political actions. That means that we created the first area of feminism and LGTBI policies led by a deputy in the Barcelona City Council. So when we arrived in 2015, there was no specific area in the City Council. But above all, from the beginning, we were really clear that gender equality and the increasing democratic participation, which we seek via the perspective of such issues as class, gender, and social origins had to be visible in every single one of the policies we put forward. So that meant having specific tools. For instance, we have a plan for gender justice. We open a table against the feminization of poverty and precariousness. We also have a new unit of gender mainstreaming, depending from general management by the city council, so to permeate every single area of politics with a gender-oriented perspective. For instance, when we drew up the municipal budget, taking into account its gender and neighborhood impacts in order to be able to compensate for inequalities where necessary. When we plan the transport network in the city, taking into account the different ways in which men and women move around. And when we design the city in general, its streets for the people, for daily use, a friendly city, accessible, not car friendly, indeed. And of course, when we are thinking about the city economic policy, and we have put people at the center, and we have recognized care work as essential for both life and the generation of wealth in the society. This shift in perspective implies modifying public budgets to provide a collective response to the care needs of the people. And of course, I can just say some specific policy actions. For instance, we have creating a free municipal babysitting service at the most vulnerable neighborhoods, doubling attention to gender violence victims, offering specific labor counseling to more than 6,000 women in a precarious situation during this last year, reducing by 35% the number of homeless women by creating specific centers for them. Then, of course, having a specific measure with more than 50 initiatives to promote women in the technological sectors, and helping transgender people through a specific job counseling service. These are some examples of really specific policy actions related with feminizing politics. And last, I shall just point some challenges that we are facing, and I think that many other municipal platforms which are in power now, they have to face. So of course, one is dealing with expectations. We cannot do everything. So a lot of people had a lot of expectations. We were going to change everything, all the systems. So of course, this is not possible. So and of course, our goal is like these small victories in daily life. So small victories that lead to a bigger change. And of course, the relation with social movements. Are we still part of the social movements? So how do we deal with what we can do for real and what we aim to do, what we want to do? Another challenge, so being inside the municipality and remaining attentive to social movement demands. It is not easy, but of course it's absolutely necessary. And we have seen during this year new social movements that have arisen in the city. They were not before. So we have to really listen to these movements, and well, this is also a challenge. Of course, many Barcelona en Comú members come from neighborhood associations and social movements, and it really helps keeping communication channels open with these associations and social movements through these members. Of course, real-time communication channels with municipal councillors, with Barcelona en Comú as organization. So keeping regular meetings, how to combine day-to-day decisions that we have to take with reflection and with the organization on how to achieve long-term changes and long-term goals. This is also a challenge. Of course, we also have a code of ethics that limits how many years we can stay in a position, limits our salaries. But this code of ethics needs to be updated, of course, and there's also a challenge. another challenge is that we are now in a government. We were in a minority government before, and now with the last elections, we are in a coalition with the Social Democrat Party. So this is really a daily challenge, and I can say because I'm in a district where we have a Social Democrat in charge in our district, but the government is shared. So this is something difficult because they have, of course, a different view of politics. And of course, dealing with media, because media is controlled by elites and big economic groups, and they are all against us. So we try to use other media, social media. Well, it is really difficult. And of course, working on topics that can gather majority supports and build from these small victories to show the path to big changes that need a majority support. And last challenge is that now we are facing endless court appeals to our most radical policies. The last one trying to stop the special urban plan for tourism accommodation, which was an instrument to regulate tourism accommodation in the city. And of course, this plan has been appealed at court. So of course we are struggling that it can really go on because this is really helping us to avoid the proliferation of tourism accommodation in the city center, but in the city in general, and reverse the process of expulsion of residents. Because as you may know, housing is a big problem in Barcelona indeed at the moment. And the last idea I want to share with you is that we need, of course, a global change. And from the beginning, those of us who were participating in Barcelona in Comú, we were sure that democratic rebellion in Barcelona wouldn't just be a local phenomenon. So we know there are different initiatives going on at the international level. So we really think that a network is really useful for that. So that's why we promote the Fearless Cities movement, which is of course an informal global movement of activists, organizations, councillors, mayors that are working to radicalize democracy, feminize politics, and drive the transition to an economy that cares for people and our environment. And the first Fearless Cities event was organized in Barcelona in 2017 and was attended by over 700 people representing over 100 municipality organizations from every continent. And we had a book published, as you may know, documenting this first Fearless City Summit, and it is translated in English and it's available in our website, Fearless City. Maybe we'll share in the chat the link to the website and where you can download the book. And since then, we had decentralized regional Fearless Cities that have been organized in different places: Brussels, Valparaiso, New York, Warsaw, Belgrade, Naples. And now this year in July, we have our second Fearless Cities event, but online, and from 5 to 10 July. And of course, we invite you all to participate and keep on discussing on these issues on municipalism as a trigger for local and global change. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Elena. Brilliant. I mean, you've been such an inspiration to so many people, the work that you've done in Barcelona, and it's become so popular, and all the different, like there is so much to it, isn't there, that it's so hard to capture, I know, in such a short space of time. There's quite a few, there's lots of questions that we probably don't have time for right now, but we'll pick a few out. Ed, did you have one that you wanted to ask?
Yeah, I mean, like you said, there's so many questions here, and I'll try and take some of them together. There's something about, there's quite a technical question about the level of sort of participation sort of through the population. How many citizens sort of agree to this approach, and how many of them actually take part? And is it easier to get beyond, you know, just to get to, I suppose, more ordinary citizens as opposed to just activists?
You mean in this platform?
Yeah, I suppose, yes, in the platform, yeah.
I don't know the number. I don't have the numbers exactly. I can look for them, I mean, for the participation. Of course, this is not everybody participating with these e-democracy tools, because of course we have a gap, a technological gap, also in our society, related of course with access to technology, and which we have seen during this pandemic, indeed, that many people could not have access to home schooling, some children. So of course, but of course, yeah, there's a lot of people that were participating, and especially when we were dealing, for instance, with the municipal action plan, and a lot of like kind of old neighborhood associations, which are mainly composed, I would say, by men and all, I would say, older people, and they were making an effort to present their initiatives through the platform and to get them to be voted. And indeed, the most voted project when we were building this municipal action plan was one action that we really could not do, because it was really a huge action to cover one of the main, let's say, roads that go around Barcelona, the Rondas. So it was impossible to do so. But of course, this means they have really a big mobilization capacity when they won. And so this is also to show, well, not to show, I mean, to let people be aware that they can really mobilize when they want to achieve something. So they were really able to mobilize a lot of people to vote for this project.
Thank you. Probably got time for one more, but time's getting on. I mean, there was a sort of question really about, which takes you back to the sort of the early stages about sort of, you talked about confluence. It seems like building confluences and political alliance seem to be something that we really struggle with here in the UK. How did you get that to come about? What were the challenges?
Well, it still is a challenge indeed, because I think other municipal initiatives that were trying to do similar thing, confluence, happening, in the elections in 2015. It was not only Barcelona who had a government with led by a citizens platform, but also Madrid, Madrid, and so the biggest, indeed the most important cities in Spain. We had these citizen platforms who won the elections, and they were trying also to kind of do some confluence, and most of them failed because it's really difficult. It's not a coalition. A coalition, you have like your part of the cake. It's like, and then to be in a confluence means not forgetting, because you are, of course, maybe in political party or in a civil organization or social movement, but you are now under the Barcelona Común name, mark, and project. So it means like a project that is like above all of that, because you are working for the same goal. So for us, I think it was a success because we were all very clear that we had the same goal, and even if we are, of course, diverse in a conference, we have diversity, and to deal with diversity is both a challenge and opportunity. Of course, it is a challenge because you have different opinions on different issues, but of course, it is an opportunity because, of course, you get a richer debate, and you get more different opportunities and possibilities to develop things. So I would say a challenge, it's like to deal with diversity and to deal, of course, with egos, of course, because you have also former political parties that, of course, they were used to work in a specific way, of course, political parties, and then people coming from social movements who are used to work in another different way. And many of the people coming from social movements, they could not be for a long time in the institution, so they prefer to go back to the social movements, some of them not. So it is still difficult to deal with, but I would say the key is to have this really clear common goal and have something really in common, which is stronger than the rest. the differences.
Thank you, Elena. It's so helpful to have that practical kind of experience that you've got. Incredibly thoughtful, meaningful work. And there's lots of questions in the chat, but I'm aware that we kind of need to go for a break. So maybe if everybody sort of holds those thoughts for the breakout rooms when we come back for the final Q&A. And then I think there are also some of those questions are things for us in the UK to really think about. They're quite sobering questions, the ones from Roxy and Ruth and others. So time for us to have a 10-minute break now and go and stretch our legs and things, and then I'll see you back here at about 23 minutes past. I think I make that. Is that right? No, 28 minutes past. Sorry, my maths is terrible. I'll see you back here then. All right, cheers everybody.
Thanks. So before we go on, we just want to have a quick chat about pagination. For those of you who've been to some of the previous sessions, you might have noticed that while we can't offer passports for the state of us, not yet at least, we can offer badges. And as we all know, education, training skills are a critical part of building economic democracy and powerful communities. How can communities take control of their own learning? One way we can do that is through pagination. So I'm going to hand you over quickly to my colleague Ruby, who's going to tell us all about that. Ruby.
Thank you, Ed. So hi everyone, my name is Ruby and I work for Real Ideas. Thank you so much for being here with us on the final event of what, in my opinion, has been a fantastic conference. It's a complete honour to share this space with all of our amazing speakers and with all of you who have taken the time to join us in this discussion in creating change. So I'm speaking to you today wearing two hats. One as an organiser of this conference and the other as a founding member of a very exciting new organisation that has the opportunity to help all of us to recognise the change that we want to see in the world. So Badge Nation is a not-for-profit, purpose-driven partnership between Real Ideas and future creators, and we use digital badges to motivate learning and ambition, whatever that might look like. I imagine your first question will most likely be, what on earth is a digital badge and what does it have to do with new municipalism? And if that's the case, I completely understand and I will do my best to clear this up. So at first mention, digital badges probably sound like a new age, complicated, high-tech piece of faff, but the idea behind them is inherently simple. As most of you know, being change-making organisations, activists and movement makers, people are so much more than just their qualifications. We all complete and achieve so much outside of those stuffy formal certificates, whether that be volunteering, attending workshops, putting skills into practice, or just doing really good things for your community. A digital badge recognises these accomplishments and immortalises them online. You won't lose a digital badge down the sofa or behind the fridge, and the possibilities are endless for what can be recorded in a badge. The best example I can give of this is my own experience as an Army cadet growing up. I collected those sew-on badges for various achievements, completing learning camps, first aid, being a member of the marching band, expeditions and volunteering. I still have these badges in an envelope at the bottom of a box under my bed, and I even have a tattoo of my corporal stripes. But these physical items mean absolutely nothing outside of the Army Cadet organisation or my own nostalgia. Had there been a digital badge for each of these achievements, I would have a record of my perseverance, my leadership, my endless hours volunteering in the community, and all of the transferable skills that came along with those experiences. Digital badges create a credible reference for people's time, commitment and knowledge, and they shout about all of the extra stuff that you won't see on a certificate. They give people and organisations the power, tools and language to better tell their stories, and even better, they're quick, they're simple and they're easy to create. If you can write a flyer, a session plan for an activity or plan an event, then you can write a digital badge. I hear you wondering, how does this relate to new municipalism and why are we getting Army Cadet stories at a conference? And the truth of it is, we each have a responsibility for building brighter futures of the people that we work with. You can write a badge about anything and award it to anyone, whether that be the young people that you support, the volunteers that you manage, or your colleagues that deliver amazing things. Young or old, we believe that everyone should have the opportunity to earn digital badges. In the first few events of this conference, we talked about how people have a right to more democratic and rewarding work, how communities can build power in their localities, and how organisations can factor in sustainability in the fight for autonomy. Digital badges give us an opportunity to break the mould on what is considered credible and valuable, whether you're a nation-spanning enterprise creating change at a higher level, or a teeny tiny friends group of your local park lifting others up through action. We don't care if you're the former or the latter. We want to support all organisations to join us in this journey of recognition and empowerment. As an introduction to the world of badges, I have written a collection of extra special conference badges to thank you all for your time and commitment in sharing this space with us over recent weeks, which you will receive very soon. You'll have an immortalised record that you have attended, shown an interest in new municipalism and building resilient communities and economic democracy, as well as skills in activism, awareness, collaboration and resilience. I hope this is a worthy expression of our gratitude for your time, as well as a good explainer for what badges can do. We will pop some links in the chat for some more information on how you can get started writing your own badges or to support other organisations to get badging, and my email address as well for any of you that would like to get in touch for a friendly chat about all things badges. So that's it from me. Thank you for listening, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference.
Thank you, Ruby, and do look out for your badges, which we'll be sending your way. Frances, let's hear a bit more from some of our fantastic speakers.
Okay, yeah, thanks, Ruby. That's great. And now I'm going to introduce you to Carly Acuna from Jackson, Mississippi Corporation, Jackson. Hey, Carly.
Greetings, everybody. You have to forgive me. My back has been bothering me really, really bad. So I'm on this sitting setup, which makes it a little bit more comfortable. But it's been a pleasure to listen and learn so far. So should I just go into, okay, all right. It's a pleasure to be here with all of you. I've been trying the last 2 days to figure out what really can be crammed into 15 minutes, since there's a lot. So this is kind of what I've settled on, I think, to try and share, to add some I think a deeper value from our experience, to kind of build onto the subject. And one critical thing I think I'd like to add is how our program and our vision has really been in response to kind of a series of structural crises. And we were very deliberately and intentionally built on that. Now, the first one that we were really responding to in a concrete sense. Now, this is not to say that there's not decades, if not centuries, of traditions and models around Black cooperatives, Black efforts at mutual aid that we are built upon. They are, but more specifically, we were built in part to kind of respond to the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina and the lessons that we had learned in Mississippi and Louisiana about the government's lack of a response and very intentional and kind of benign neglect towards so many communities, and particularly towards Black, Vietnamese, and Indigenous people, and Latinos and migrant workers in those areas. So we really tried to design a program that would build the community's capacity to kind of serve as many of its own material and social needs as possible, while at the same time not letting the government off the hook for its obligations and responsibilities, but not learning from Katrina that we don't want to be totally dependent upon the government, because it could very easily, as was demonstrated there, choose to overlook its responsibilities and look the other way and just enable the suffering, not just allow, but enable the suffering of many people. So building up our own kind of productive institutions, to deal with food, to deal with housing, in some cases to deal with transportation, to deal with healthcare. These became kind of front and center in what our model was built upon. Now we've been prepared in many respects on the basis of that practice for a new set of crises that have emerged. For us in our locality, one, there's been adjusting to COVID, which has radically changed so many things in our community, and I think in many respects is going to change them on a permanent basis, despite this great rush from all the politicians and all the kind of mainstream businesses to get, quote unquote, back to normal as soon as possible, regardless of the health and the consequences of the community. So really adjusting to this reality. And then in our case, we just recently suffered in February a historic freeze throughout most of the southwestern portion of the United States. This polar vortex came down, and basically from Texas all the way to Georgia, there was just a massive freeze for 3 weeks, which is unprecedented for that far in the deep south, where you have freezing temperatures that held consistent for that long. Most of the infrastructure in the South, but particularly in Jackson, was not built with that type of kind of climate reality in mind. And in our case, it really just destroyed, and I do mean this little, destroyed much of our city's water delivery infrastructure, most of which was old and antiquated to begin with. A lot of it being lead pipes, which were placed down, some of it in the late 19th century and the early 20th century. So it just really crippled that in our city. After these 3 weeks of freezing cold, then spent a month trying to get the water pressure and the water filtration back in operation. So this went on well into early April. And to this day, the city still hasn't fully adjusted to this kind of new situation. It's just kind of ad hoc fixes here and there. And one of the ways in which we've adapted and adjusted is actually conducting a water delivery and a mutual aid delivery program every other Friday, because the need is still so great, including for water, drinkable and portable water, because you just cannot get clean water or trustworthy water in the city. So much the boil notices that come from the city mean sometimes you can't even bathe in it. This is the reality of where our infrastructure is at and where the state's kind of capacity is at. And I put this really on the state, not on the municipality. Let me be clear about that. The municipality has been trying to address this challenge for many a year, because this is not something that's particularly new. It's just being aggravated in the scales, I think, of it being kind of held in a stasis of semi-repair. Like, that's totally just been altered. The main problem that we have is an ultra-conservative state government, which will block federal funding on many cases. Like in our case, our governor is one of these who's kind of taken the lead as part of kind of the new right-wing movement in the United States on denying federal benefits, so that folks can't continue to get unemployment, even though the pandemic is far from over in Mississippi. And even though there's no child care for many people, particularly women, to re-enter into the workforce, because the systems just haven't been rebuilt. And in many cases in our community, they were inadequate to begin with. So, dealing with this new reality is a piece that we are now trying to respond to, kind of a post-COVID dynamic. and now this kind of new infrastructure dynamic. And what it speaks to, I think, is continues to addresses the, dare I say it, that we were correct in our assessment some 15 years ago, that we kind of had to follow this outside inside model of community development and developing economic democracy from below. But we are now faced with some even greater challenges because of the post-COVID-19 and this new response. And it's very clear to us at this particular point in time that we are going to have to mobilize our community on a new level to build a new type of infrastructure to deal with the basic needs around water and around energy in our community. And you're doing this in a community which is already extremely impoverished. So we're just coming up with the most innovative ways that you can think of, which in some respects are getting some support from the municipality, even though they kind of go in the face of all the different types of regulations that are established by the state and federal government, because it sees directly for itself that people's needs have to be met, even if there's not the direct capacity of the municipal instrument to kind of follow through on it within the accordance of the kind of established law. So there's one set of dynamics where we know now very specifically this next 4 years, if not the next decade, is cultivating kind of a national level responsive coalition to really deal with the deep infrastructure crisis. And this is already beginning to emerge, not necessarily in the way that we would frame it, but you hear a lot of this already in Biden's presentation around this new infrastructure bill, where there's this tremendous debate that he's beginning to have with the Republicans over what is the definition of infrastructure, right? Because I think he's rightly so, and his advisors are rightly so, really pointing to that there's a new type of infrastructure to meet the 21st century and the broad comprehensive needs that has to be developed for everybody. Now they're developing it, unfortunately, with a dynamic of competition, particularly with China in mind, and not one which is fundamentally centered on meeting human needs. And those two things kind of go in opposite directions. So ours is, how do we develop these to meet the human needs in our community? And how do we do so in a way that we ensure that what is produced, it remains in the common space, not something that's privately appropriated or so state controlled and regulated as to then reinforce all the existing dynamics and inequalities. So for us, we're talking about building an autonomous infrastructure. And one of the key pieces that we've been working on as hard as diligently as we can over the past 2 months is really building up our own capacity on our community land trust, which is one of the key institutions, I would say right now, really the cornerstone institution of Cooperation Jackson, is building out our capacity to have our own water storage and our own energy utility in the form of kind of a solar farm on it. And we've already made some pretty significant headway just in the past 2 months of mobilizing the community, drawing resources directly from the community to be able to build up this capacity. So we think this is in many respects a new vision of the future and a new set of practices that we're going to have to adopt to address really the crumbling infrastructure that exists within the United States, which, given the political dynamic, we don't see being repaired through the kind of standard political process anytime soon. And we don't, I mean, that is a challenge within itself, don't get me wrong, but it also presents more opportunity, because as a result, we see more people having to become directly engaged in the direct governance questions in their community in a way that, kind of when the state has just been able to provide services without people kind of thinking about it or thinking that they were natural and normal, really kind of left it just kind of to an agency out there, as opposed to how do we develop our own agencies and capacities. So this side of it is really deepening the democratic practice in our community. We've seen a major kind of upturn from where we were at just 3 or 4 months ago. Now, granted, a lot of things slowed down because of COVID, but even, I would say, even compared to where we were pre-COVID, the level of democratic engagement in our community has gone up. And this is one of Jackson has been, I would say, over the course of the last 15 years, really a high point of even pre-COVID, the level of community engagement, particularly through our people's assemblies and things of that nature, where there was a high level of engagement. Well, that's gone up pretty significantly in the past 2 months. And now I think the challenge is, how do we translate this into a set of common institutions that everybody can buy into and see working in development that we can sustain in the long haul. Because we all know that in times of crisis, folks need kind of immediate need. Times the things that address the systemic issues that lay beneath that take many years, if not decades, to kind of build out and be able to address. So this is one of the kind of creative tensions that we are aware of and trying to get ahead of to the best of our ability. But really looking forward to the challenge, because I think in our case, I would be remiss in saying that we have some great concerns about the future, not only of Mississippi, but the United States, because of the growing strength of the right. In particular, even though one would think that after what happened on January 6th, that Trump and many of the forces that support him would have become weaker politically, when in fact they're becoming more consolidated and stronger on the basis of what happened. So this is a major counterpoint that we have to organize for. So seeing this kind of mass engagement is a real encouraging sign around the energy, particularly from the Ford Rebellion, not waning, but being sustained, and I think moving us to a higher place of kind of internal development and self-sustainability. Now, the issue is when and how is this going to clash? Because we know inevitably there's going to be some clash between these two set of forces. And do we have enough time to get prepared in the face of what the right historically in the United States has been willing to do, which is commit, tremendous acts of violence, particularly against Black, Latino, Indigenous people that have been othered in some way? Do we have enough time to build up our capacity to be able to both deal with that, and more importantly, I think, to move some of the critical sectors of kind of the white working class to a new practice and a new orientation? Like, that is something we can't overlook, and we think us gaining in strength and being able to build these kind of alternatives, which we can demonstrate that our communities are on their own effort, building a better quality of life. We believe this could move many of the critical poor white communities, which live oftentimes very adjacent to us, move them in some dynamic ways that takes them out of the influence of many of these right-wing forces. So this is a part of our challenge that we are welcoming in many respects, because we see that things could either go horribly wrong or they could be very transformative, and it's just really a pivot between the two, and it's very clear which one we're aiming for and what we're trying to build through our efforts and activities. So I would encourage everybody to stay tuned and stay connected, because we're all going to need each other on an international basis to make this work.
Thank you, Carly. Yeah, I can really feel that. I just a question from me before we go to the ones in the chat. And just the level of resources you're able to mobilize in your community, are they, obviously there's financial and kind of people's own time and labor and that kind of thing. Is there anything coming from the municipality or the state at all to you?
In direct aid, no. In indirect aid, plenty, right? So I mean, we've also, just to be clear, we've adopted, this is Cooperation Jackson, we've adopted a kind of a principle that we haven't directly requested, funds or resources from the municipality, right? And that is kind of based upon a practice and a politic that one, we are trying to break. Let me just be very clear and explicit. We are trying to break a very particular dynamic in our city and many cities, many particularly Black-led cities, where there's kind of a particular class that gets cultivated to dominate the resources of the municipality through contracting mechanisms, right? Where there's the kind of a Black political class which owns and dominates that process and dynamic in a totally undemocratic way. And for us, since there's an administration which is very close to us, we also have many differences with them, politically, but they are all our old friends, our old comrades. We know them well. We helped them get in the office several times now. I used to work actually for the municipality to try to implement this program. That we've been trying to build up the resources and capacity outside of that to not fall into this kind of patronage model, but also to stay away from the kind of politics of people thinking that because these are our friends that we're getting kickbacks and things of that nature, right? Which is a real thing in many places in our area. And we're trying to be value added to the overall municipality by bringing in more resources than we're extracting from the municipality. That's a very clear and explicit thing for us. But what the municipality does do is give us permission to move and utilize a lot of public resources, public lands in particular, to augment, what we're doing for farming and things of that nature. So making the space available where the ownership necessarily hasn't been transformed, but we say, hey, we want to put this, since it's not being used in productive capacity, to get somebody to farm it. Can we get an agreement from you to do that for 3 years or 5 years, whatever the case may be? And that the municipality, things like that, the municipality gives a great amount of support to, which is just opens up. And part of why we even pursued our particular brand of municipalism was to recognize that the state is a limited instrument from our perspective. But what we needed and wanted to do was open up space for the social movements to be able to build their own capacity to act in a self-determined way. And I think our municipality has done a great job of that in many respects. And it has to, because it recognizes that it doesn't have, the resources. So like one of the big challenges for us, just so everybody's clear, we know there's a major battle now that's going to happen about the privatization of our water system. But here's the challenge, is that even though this is being pushed by the state and by numerous capital forces for well over a decade now, they now have the upper hand, I think, because of this, recent catastrophe. But here's the issue, private capital wants to come in and gut what exists. Well, what we have is there's really nothing to gut because there's very little there. But we also know that they're not going to put in, 10 to $15 billion to repair the system, right? And so if the state doesn't provide those resources, what are they going to privatize, in essence, because they're not going to build that capacity, only to maybe lose it if it could be remunicipalized down the road. So we are now looking at this kind of uncertain future where it's too broke for them to privatize, since they're not going to invest in it, but it doesn't meet our needs. So how do we fill the gaps? And so the municipality right now, I think, is in a space of, trying to figure this all out with us and with many other players in the community, and we'll see what happens in that regard.
Thank you. And one of the questions is that, do you think it's easier to get a lot of people involved when they're fearful or think the government doesn't care, or and I'm just adding to that, to wonder whether actually they're inspired by what you're doing as well? So that's also a call to action.
Inspired, but let me be clear that particularly the Black community has had in Mississippi, like throughout most of the United States, but particularly in Mississippi, the Black community is fairly used to having to do a number of critical things on its own, because it's not going to get and has never received the resources from the state government as other communities have. And so folks, are already in many respects very self-reliant. And I think what we are adding to that is, rather than kind of an individual or family-based self-reliance, a communal and collective self-reliance. And I think that is becoming more and more inspiring to folks, to know that they can pull together beyond just their family unit and rely on a broader set of networks and resources and people in the community, to draw from. I think that is where what we've been doing, particularly with the water distribution stuff, we've seen that just grow by leaps and bounds, that like, oh, there's other people carrying this, other people doing this, and we found folks who've added on to us, like they were just, maybe someone who had some additional income was providing water for folks on their block. They've now joined, and there's about 10 folks who were doing that in their community, or like on their street, who've now added on to us and are part of our funding pool and part of our resource bank of folks who are helping to distribute it. So we've seen that type of activity, I think, really increase, which has been deeply encouraging as kind of a countermeasure to many of the things that the messaging that was coming out from COVID, at least in Mississippi, which is basically don't ask the state for anything, because we're not going to provide for anything, and you're basically on your own. Your healthcare is on your own, your own well-being is on your own. So folks coming together with a counter practice and a counter narrative, I think, and buying into it in the face of that kind of orientation, to me, has been very beautiful.
Yeah, no, I'm sure. And just one last question before we close with talking to you about this particular kind of bit. Are you kind of standalone pioneers, or do you work as part of a broader network?
Broader network.
Mm.
I mean, we couldn't do what we do without a broader network. We just don't have, I mean, we have a nice size base, but to try to do everything, would take thousands of people to do. And we aren't there yet, but we're also pushing back against this model that like one organization that has to have thousands of people. I mean, it would be nice. I wouldn't, bet against it in some respects, but there's also a kind of a new politics of federation that has really grown in the United States, where people can kind of reserve their autonomy and come in and come out when they so choose, and how they are aligned. And that's something that resonates with us. Particularly this allowed us a great deal of flexibility when, particularly given sometimes the very hostile politics in Mississippi.
Oh, I was hoping that might be a glitch. Okay, maybe we can hold that thought until the final session with the Q&As, and hope Carly can join us again. But maybe Matthew, can I hand over to you? So our final speaker is Matthew Thompson from Liverpool University, and we've asked you to kind of listen to the other speakers and also offer reflections on that, as well as your own thoughts, Matthew. So really appreciate that.
Thanks. Well, thanks for the invite. It's a pleasure to be here to speak along such inspiring voices, and I'll do my best to do that kind of summary task that you've asked of me. Although, to be honest, I have got 15 slides here, which suggests less summary and more kind of new content. But I'll do my best to sum it up and sort of try and put it into the context of British municipalism, really, and maybe the case of Plymouth too, right? Do tell me to shut up if I talk for too long as well. So before I do that, I want to sort of take us back a bit to the kind of the historical and sort of ideological roots of municipalism. And a lot of this can sort of be traced back to one of the big kind of thinkers, I guess, in this is Murray Bookchin. So the eco-socialist and anarchist Murray Bookchin, whose daughter Debbie Bookchin is very important and kind of influential in the movement today, particularly in Spain. And his idea was around drawing on historical examples, really, around assemblies and cooperatives and communes. So particularly, for instance, the Paris Commune in 1871, this kind of revolutionary space where the people of Paris took Paris away from the French state for a number of weeks. It's amazing kind of historical example, which Bookchin draws upon, tries to draw out this idea of citizenship that's different to a kind of national state citizenship. So the citizenship involved in municipalism, or what he calls libertarian municipalism. There's other names along these lines around communalism, democratic confederalism, and I'll explain some of these in a bit. The idea of citizenship is that it's bound up with cities rather than just, say, urbanization or nation states, and cities being really important rather than just urbanization itself, because cities are kind of these centers of activity. They enable encounter and assembly to happen. They enable people to come together and deliberate and kind of and work off each other and kind of and organize. So cities, rather than just, say, urbanization, is really quite important to this kind of politics of proximity, which is at the center of what we might call municipalism or communalism. And out of that, we have these things called assemblies, people's assemblies, in the kind of space of politics and cooperatives, the space of economy. And these together, if you like, sort of lay the foundation for a different kind of polity, an alternative sort of society that is very different to. The idea is it replaces eventually the nation state and capitalism. This is quite a radical idea. These are really sort of radical, quite far-reaching theories that have been picked up in recent decades, around the rise of new municipalism. And it links to quite a distinctive strategic approach, which I think Cooperation Jackson and Carly Cuno has articulated certainly a lot in the past around how amazing they do it there. They've really sort of run with this idea of dual power. And perhaps Carly can elaborate on this later. You do it certainly better than I can. But this is the idea that you construct a kind of secondary pole of power to the nation state, outside of the nation state, that eventually supersedes it. So you effectively kind of expand the commons, and you build alternative autonomous institutions like cooperatives, like people's assemblies, that then try and push for this kind of prefigurative alternative that is feminist, that is anti-racist, that is ecologically sustainable, and so on, and pushes us towards a post-capitalism, what people might call a solidarity economy, something that can emerge out of the shell of the old, if you like. And at the same time, this is why it's dual. At the same time, this first approach is supported by another, which is about engaging with the state, so leveraging concessions from the state, taking hold of local political institutions through mobilizing social movements, as we see in the case of Barcelona on Comú. So Barcelona on Comú is a real kind of exemplar of this kind of approach, winning electoral office through platforms, through sort of different ways of mobilizing people for that task, outside of the party form, which is very much bound up with representative democracy in the nation state, and then reimagining and transforming that state from the inside through kind of a guerrilla occupation or kind of insurgency of bureaucracies. And then using the power that you have to not only transform the state structures, but then to actually offer support, funding, policy support, and so on, to cultivate that kind of autonomous power that Cooperation Jackson, I think, really embodies quite beautifully. And this is a bit of a busy slide, and I won't go into it too much, but this is with this in mind, with this idea of dual power and kind of the assembly and the commune in mind. I thought it would be good just to sort of draw out some of the differences in this new movement of what we call new municipalism. And if you're interested, this is based on an article I recently wrote, or last year, called "What's So New About New Municipalism," which is open access. You can find it online and have a read if you can't read all this now. And here I sort of draw the differences out around this idea of dual power, I guess. I draw the differences out between the likes of Cooperation Jackson, which I see as a kind of autonomous style of municipalism. I argue they're a kind of autonomous municipalism. Barcelona on Comú and the kind of confluences and the Spanish confluences are a different kind of municipalism. They are what I argue to be a platform municipalism, partly using that language because they rely on citizen platforms, which are different to the party, and that they also use technological and digital platforms to do kind of digital decision making, through budgeting and decide on, sort of voting platforms. And at the same time, I've also trying to compare these two kind of more quintessential municipalisms, if you like, with the third, with what I argue to be a managed municipalism, which is slightly different, I think, and some would say it doesn't really come under the rubric of municipalism as understood in that kind of book-chin assembly style. And this, if you like, we can see in terms of the community wealth building movement that's really emerged in the US and the UK in the last few years, very much around the Preston model, tied up with outcomes, generating outcomes around economic democracy through procurement and worker-owned co-ops, for instance, rather than, say, process-oriented, which is what I think platform and autonomists are much more geared toward. They're much more interested in prefigurative, so being the change you want to see, really sort of embodying that the kind of change in the processes of political democracy that they instill. And if you like, these differences can be teased apart and represented in their relationship to the state. So this famous phrase that is bandied around quite a fair bit, in, against, and beyond the state. We can see these three different forms of municipalism being represented in this different kind of poles, or these different kind of approaches to the state. So community wealth building, managed municipalism, is very much inside the state. It's technocratic engineering from the inside through procurement levers and trying to generate change from the top down, if you like, trying to cultivate bottom-up practices, but through kind of technocratic levers in the first instance. And some would argue in the movement against that, of course, but we can have that debate if you like. Against the state, and this is the language is a bit simplistic here, of course, because Barcelona and Camus are doing all these three things. But if you like, they're kind of against the state. They're transforming the state through these kind of novel forms of electoral strategy around citizen platforms. And then beyond the state is very much this kind of autonomous sort of approach, which Rojava and Corporation Jackson embody, which is really sort of moving towards this stateless society of confederated co-ops. The thing that I failed to mention earlier about Bookchin is that the assemblies and co-ops that are sort of the kind of cell structure of a new society beyond the state, the really important thing about them is that they are confederated. They are sort of federated up into networks at regional structure and eventually global structure. So this idea of a confederation of communes is really important. And this is how we can get beyond this kind of idea of a local trap, or the local global kind of paradox or dilemma, which the nation state kind of resolves through its regulation of about borders and boundaries. Well, potentially municipalists can start to network and federate with each other and actually start to create supply chains and forms of regulation and forms of governance which are kind of democratic and move beyond the nation state in the way that we think of it. A big debate in all this, and it has been brought up today, I think, is this sort of idea of, is it political or is it economic democracy? So, I mean, obviously it's both, and this is summed up in Corporation Jackson's slogan, the democratization of society and the socialization of production, political and economic democracy. But Debbie Bookchin, the daughter of Murray Bookchin, for instance, who's now very much involved in some of the Spanish conferences I mentioned earlier, she really sort of goes to town and really sort of sums it up in quite straightforward terms, that new municipalism is not about implementing progressive policies, but about returning power to ordinary people. So it's not just about what Ada Colau would call the temple, this kind of like preordained set of policy instruments. It's an agora. Okay, so we're sort of going back to this idea of ancient Athenian democracy. So marketplace is a kind of arena of decision making of different kind of groups arguing over what deliberating over what future they want. So I think this is a really important point, that this is not a kind of, as I say, a set of policy prescriptions. This is a kind of method, a method to actually sort of push forward a different kind of society. And this links very much to this idea of the feminization of politics, as Elena said earlier, and to this idea of kind of collective theory building. So we're not just relying on off-the-shelf models from elsewhere. We're doing this together. So with all this in mind, the big question for me is, can we design this stuff in from the top down? Can progressive technocrats in cities or others like us, people, social entrepreneurs, people involved in co-ops, people involved in community organizing, if you like, there's a certain sense of professionalism in that. Can we design this stuff in? Can we kind of generate this change from the top down, or from kind of these kind of progressive policy approaches, progressive organizing approaches? I'm aware I'm running out of time, but I'll take a quick dive into the history of this and suggest that it has been tried before in London, in the Greater London Council in the mid-80s, 81 to 86. As Owen Hatherley's new book, very interesting new book, has beautifully sort of explicated it, was a really radical endeavour. And really, if you like, as a kind of prototypical municipalism. So they were anti-racist, anti-imperialist, anti-sexist, and if you like, quite anti-capitalist. And they supported a lot of cooperatives, community organising in different boroughs in London. I haven't got a lot of time to go into it right now, but they were in many ways embodying many of the kind of municipalist principles that we take value today. And they were influenced, the Greater London Council, let the Labour-run government at the time, was influenced by a strong degree by this book, In and Against the State. And this is where this phrase comes from, right? In and Against and Beyond the State comes from this kind of, these ideas in the late 1970s. This book was written in 1979 by a collective that included John MacDonald, the former Shadow Chancellor of the Exchequer, who was also involved in the Greater London Council, where he cut his teeth, and John Holloway, a Marxist autonomist thinker. And this stuff was kind of laid the groundwork, I think, for sort of thinking about how to be a kind of insurgent or a kind of guerrilla in the bureaucracies of the state, and trying to sort of transform them from within. And we see these ideas kind of resounding down the decades, if you like, and taking hold now in the likes of Preston. So the Centre for Local Economic Strategies, or CLES, the think tank that is driving forward some of the stuff going on in Preston today, very much responsible, if you like, for those original ideas around procurement flows and sort of capturing procurement flows and diverting some of the procurement of anchor institutions to worker-owned co-ops and social enterprises, and generating some of this sort of municipalist action, if you like, from the top down. Those ideas came from CLES, if you like, or from NEF originally, from the New Economics Foundation. Some of these think tanks, and particularly CLES, came out of that earlier wave in the 1980s. So CLES was set up by the Greater London Council and by a few of the other metropolitan borough councils before they were taken apart and effectively kind of shut down by Thatcher. So in the dying days of their lives, they were basically they seeded a load of money to set up CLES, which was to take on some of these ideas. And admittedly, in the few decades since, they've gone in different directions, but in a way they're now coming back around full circle and sort of trying to experiment some of these ideas on the ground. So we see this in Preston to a certain extent. It's proved quite successful. Some are arguing at the moment that the local elections, even though they were incredibly dire for Labour nationally, in those areas that have experimented with community wealth building, with some of the kind of Preston model ideas, Preston included, Salford is another one, the sensible socialist mayor of Salford here, called Bennett, increased his vote share to 59%, for instance. So it wasn't all doom and gloom for Labour. So we see some positive news coming out of this. But what I want to argue here is that I guess they don't necessarily go far enough. Community wealth building, as I say, is kind of it's part of that managed municipalist tradition, and I think it lacks something. There is a kind of gap somewhere within this sort of this approach, within this strategic approach. It's a lopsided dual power approach, if you like, and it lacks some of the some other aspects I think are really important. And those aspects I think are important. It's to do with space, creating the space for struggle for dual power. So Henri Lefebvre, the Marxist sociologist, the great Marxist philosopher, whose ideas around the right to the city, particularly the right to the city, are very influential in the Spanish municipalist movement and elsewhere at the moment. His ideas for what was along the lines, he said, for instance, to change life, we must first change space. It doesn't mean that necessarily just literally that we need to have the physical spaces where they are important. He's also thinking about the lived space of everyday life, the kind of the dreams and the memories, the collective memories, the kind of rituals and the imagination and desires that we live out our daily lives are really important. And we need also the material spaces to sort of to imagine these things and go about our lives. At the same time, that's this lived space idea that Lefebvre talked about. It's complemented by this idea of conceived space. So there's conceived space. This is the space of kind of planners, of rationality, of logic, of visions, of representations of space, maps and models and theories, and if you like, of experts. And this really, conceived space is an incredibly important aspect in the production of space, but it's only one aspect, and lived space is the other. And I think we've in the Preston model, for instance, we've kind of and community wealth building, we've pushed for conceived space, the space of planners, at the detriment of lived space, and thinking about how that can be enhanced and sort of generate different kinds of spatial practices. And I'm thinking here of some of the first waves of municipalism that came out of late 19th century Italy, or in and around Bologna and Emilia-Romagna, which today is, of course, hosts one of the most powerful cooperative kind of industries sectors in the world. And Margaret Cohn has written a really interesting history of this, about the houses of the people. So there was these material spaces that working class communities built quite literally in Italian towns and communes at the turn of the century, the turn of the 19th century to the 20th century. And these contained chambers of labour, so they contained spaces for co-ops and mutual aid societies to have offices and and workshops. They also contained theatres, and they contained bars and pubs and libraries and spaces for encounter. and seminar rooms and lecture theatres and so on, and spaces effectively for collective joy, for public education and popular education, which are these kind of really important spaces, if you like, the kind of material spaces that generate the solidarities and the kind of excitement and the mutual learning and the strategic kind of thinking that would require to actually build a movement collectively in a space. And I think that's what's lacking today, right? That's what's lacking in some of the stuff that we're thinking about in the UK. And I think this series of seminars and this conference, the State of Us, is trying to fill that gap. I think it does a really interesting job here of actually starting to talk about this in a kind of collective education project. I mentioned the Paris Commune earlier, and Christian Ross's book on the Paris Commune suggests that education and these sort of spaces of participation and encounter and assembly were also really important. So in the years that ran up to 1871, Paris was alive with this kind of revolutionary ferment in kind of clubs and salons and kind of these spaces of working class kind of encounter. There were often spaces of debauchery and kind of collective joy, but there were also spaces where people, argued for these kind of communist futures against the French state and against the capitalist class at the time. So they were really important aspects, kind of cell structure of the future. And Red Bologna, which obviously, if you like, the period of the Bologna came under Communist Party rule in the 20th century, from the 1950s to the 1970s. They were really big on education. So they put in place, if you like, this was kind of the heir to the kind of those houses of the people and the kind of 19th century municipalist movements I just talked about. They put in place a really radical education program in the city. It was all about universal, non-specialized education, and so did the Paris Commune. So education is a big part of these movements, which I think we forget today, and we need to really think about how we start changing hearts and minds more broadly, and across the public more broadly, and not just within our own kind of activist spaces. So with all that kind of background history, and I'll try and sum up now because I know I'm getting close. I've been banging on for far too long, but here's a few examples of what's going on in this sort of space of kind of encounter and assembly and cooperation in a kind of more traditional sort of municipalist mode rather than say community wealth building. You've got the same collective, Solidarity Against Neoliberal Extremism, what a great name, the same collective in Glasgow. In Glasgow, they're trying to start kind of conversations, public conversations, leading to the idea of a people's plan. So they're going to try and create a people's plan, not driven by experts, but driven by people. You've got cooperation towns springing up across the country, and I think partly they were inspired by Carly Aquino's last visit to the UK, if I'm wrong, in 2019. People were inspired by Cooperation Jackson's set up their own cooperation towns here. There's a movement around the world, I guess, that's sort of using this kind of phraseology, and they're involved with mutual aid food co-ops, trying to solve food poverty and create basically forms of solidarity around food in urban areas. You've got Beacon in Liverpool, which is a very recent non-party platform that I'm loosely involved with. We're sort of trying to write a manifesto at the moment. We're trying to think about how we can move past the kind of really quite toxic kind of party politics that's really setting into Liverpool at the moment, or has done in the last few years. And Middleton Cooperating, for instance, is another interesting project that I'm loosely involved in Greater Manchester. In North Manchester, there's a small group of co-ops and social enterprises and charities who are all trying to come together around this idea of Middleton Cooperating, which is a community benefit society that's trying to do community wealth building from the bottom up. So they have like 5 membership groups, if you like, and some of those are anchor organisations like big universities and the big housing associations. Some of the groups, are represented by co-ops and some by local residents. But the idea, rather than starting with the council and with the universities and the anchor institutions like you would say in Preston, they're starting from the grassroots and then inviting those into their kind of into this catalyst of community wealth building, which is this organisation. I guess we shouldn't forget the kind of top-down stuff as well. I mean, it's in places where it does exist, where there's devolution, there are levers to pull. It's really important to pull them. So in Greater Manchester recently, there's been some interesting moves toward pushing lobbying Andy Burnham for a land commission along the lines of Liverpool Land Commission that might start to think about the way that public land is divested, trying to democratise and socialise that land. And what does all this mean for Plymouth? So, I mean, I've done my best to try and think about how some of this stuff might work in terms of Plymouth. And here you can see that I've tried to sort of group some of Plymouth's assets and some of Plymouth's distinctive approaches along the lines of the kind of three-part typology I introduced earlier. So managed, autonomous, and platform municipalism. And I guess if we're trying to think through this, because my research is about Plymouth to some extent, and I'm trying to think through what the Plymouth model is, if there is a model or if some sort of pathway is, and how does that relate to the Preston model, which is celebrated in the press a lot. I'd say it's quite distinctive. I mean, there's a sense in which Plymouth has a lot going for it. Right? So it has a cooperative council, or rather did have up until recently, we can discuss that. Assumes some really interesting public common partnerships with cooperatives, setting up things along the lines of Plymouth Energy Community. Very interesting cooperative involved in generating a community land trust and solar energy. It's also linked into Cooperative Council's innovation network nationally. And you have Plymouth, I think the biggest asset is this very long-standing tradition, this very rich ecosystem of social and solidarity economy organising. And I think the thing that struck me is these community anchor organisations, like Real Ideas Organisation, like Nudge Community Builders, like Millfields and so on. There's many across the city. It's quite similar to the way that Liverpool works as well, I think, and Glasgow, I guess, port cities, western edge port cities, working class cities, have these community anchor organisations in the neighbourhoods. And these, if you like, can act as a kind of conduit and as kind of hubs, as sort of as the infrastructure that fits the gap between citizens and people and the anchor institutions that are celebrated in Preston. And I think that's something the Preston model misses to its detriment. And lastly, I guess, is this thing around is how do we build platforms? So if we're building dual power in a kind of in a balanced way, how do we think about electoral strategies in the context where, you know, as I say, the Cooperative Council's seems to have lost its mandate recently. So how do we build a platform beyond that? And I don't know much about what's going on in Plymouth around that. Maybe some of you guys can put us in and talk about that. And lastly, I know I've gone one at a time, so I do apologise. If we got to look transnationally, and Carly started to articulate this towards the end there, didn't he? That when we start talking about networks, we need to think about how do we actually organise this transnationally, translocally, and that's the really important aspect of municipalism, which we need to really hold dear, I think, because it's the thing that really enables it to become this sort of radical alternative beyond the state. So here I've just raised a few what I think are interesting networks and organisations. So some radical funders like the Transnational Institute that really put a lot of money into this stuff, quite independently minded. Some podcasts that sort of help with the education aspects of this. It's urban political, it's quite academic, but you know, it's along these lines. You've got Million that I'm involved with. It's a network of municipal, sort of global network of municipalist activists and thinkers, and trying to sort of create a space for publishing stuff around this. The Symbiosis, which is a really interesting federation along the lines of this idea of Bookchin's confederation model in the US. So in the US, a lot, I think Corporation Jackson's a member of Symbiosis, but Carly could correct me if I'm wrong. And Cities for Change, for instance. So there's some events that Cities for Change are organising over the next few days. I think one tomorrow, so have a look at that. And this is coming out of Amsterdam. Amsterdam is a very interesting city alongside Barcelona that's pushing some of this stuff. So I'll leave it there for now. Maybe we can talk more in questions. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Matt. That was great. So I'm just thinking we should go to breakout rooms so that people can kind of take stock of everything that they've heard, and that really good summary from you, Matt. What a great thing to be able to just study things and visit and talk to people about it and just kind of think about it. That's just, yeah, it must be quite a lovely thing to do. So if we're going to put people into breakout rooms for about 15 minutes, so that you can kind of mull over what you've heard, kind of have a bit of a discussion and come back with some questions, some key questions for our 4 speakers for the last kind of 15 minutes that we've got together. So I'll see you on the other side of that. Come back. I see that there's just a hardcore left at the end, but I was really, really glad that you could stay with us. So I think we've got time for a couple of questions, and so if you had something you wanted to drop into the chat, but I've just been really dwelling on the thought about like literally meeting basic needs and how far we can sort of take community ownership of the like fundamental infrastructures like food systems, transport, water. And I wondered, I'd obviously take each of you in turn, but Tobler, what do you think about that?
Yeah, it's so funny because we were just speaking about that just now. as we got cut off into the main room. Another fellow community activist was just saying that that is crucial. You know, without those basic essentials, how can we operate as societies without food and water? So I think it really does start there. And we were just speaking about how do we bring this thinking and these frameworks and academic terminology into a more practical kind of, understanding in our communities. She was speaking about hers and I was speaking about mine. But I think that would be interesting just to think about the next steps in our communities. How would we, bring some of these learnings that we've got today into our communities? And I was just thinking of the Jackson project. I really love to connect with Kylie because, so many similarities. I think they're much further down the line than we are, just in terms of addressing basic needs and specifically water. So I'd love to understand those types of, solutions that they've brought there. I would love to see how we can apply that to our local context.
Thank you. And Elena, just thinking about what you were saying about the court action against you trying to municipalize the water system. How likely is it that that will happen? Do you think that you'll be able to take the water back?
Yeah, I think we will be able to do so because most of the people in Barcelona want so. So I don't know how long it will take. I mean, because we have a lot of difficulties with the law and with the interest of the corporation, the big corporation in charge of the water supply. So I think it will be slower than we think, but we'll get it back. Yeah, I'm sure of it. Mostly because we have most of the community for that. I mean, most of the Barcelona citizenship who think that this will be really positive. And we have seen the experiences of other big towns in Catalonia, such as Terrassa, which is like not far from Barcelona, and they have municipalized their water supply, and well, it is working quite well.
Great, thank you. And Carly, and just like your ambitions for like food growing, transport and energy, and being completely independent and autonomous, is that something that you are fully pursuing?
Sorry, it took me a minute to get off mute. Yes. I mean, to the greatest extent possible, yes. But it's also in the context of just overall systemic change, right? The point of being an example is just to demonstrate, what is possible, but not just to be, kind of an island unto ourselves. So there's a broader aspiration of how do we include, as many people as possible and have that be the basis of, the transformation of society, particularly at this critical juncture of where things are at with, the climate and the sixth extinction that we are facing. So trying to think big and long term is a critical piece to that, but just starting from where we are and moving from there.
Thank you. And Matt, from the people that you've spoken to, do you see that there's a pool of different examples that people can draw on and draw inspiration from, and practical examples?
In what respects, Francis? What, in terms of community welfare in the UK, or
just broadly across internationally, about people taking kind of more, taking back sort of infrastructure from corporations, basically the sort of the basic needs that we need to meet.
I mean, some of the stuff that I'm looking at is mostly about the UK and about different forms of kind of entrepreneurial sort of municipalism in councils. So when councils sort of start to do some quite interesting work around energy, for instance, Plymouth energy community that I mentioned earlier, PEC, which was set up as a council enterprise, as a kind of 51% owned council enterprise, but the other percentage, or maybe it's 49%, it's half and half. The other is owned in the community. I think that's how it started, but it's now become fully sort of independent trust that also has cooperative kind of members to it, and they're kind of developing community-led housing, in a community land trust that is all linked into kind of renewable energy provision, solar power generation. So there's some really interesting examples there where the council are taking quite a sort of interventionist role into this stuff, but not just sort of doing it heavy-handedly, but actually sort of working with people who are going to be the kind of users and the consumers of this stuff, and the participants to actually then to actually do this. But I think it's just that the initiative has to come from somewhere, and I guess that's kind of the big question it's the big question for British municipalism, if you like, now, of the community wealth building. Where does that energy come from? Is it driven from progressive politicians or progressive sort of experts or progressive community organisers or whatever, or is it driven in the Spanish confluences is much more driven by social movements, by people on the streets, the 15M movement and so on. And obviously they have had community organisers, but it was a different relationship, I think. And maybe in Britain we just have got decades and decades of the kind of breaking up of solidarity structures, and kind of we've all sort of atomized in our own homes and just sort of watching TV. Maybe that's a sort of standard answer, but I guess where's the energy come from for this stuff? But anyway, I've gone off on one from the original question. So.
No, I think they're good questions. Oh, there's nothing wrong with watching TV. I'd just like to say, just not all the time. I'm just going to, there's one more question, and I'm going to pick one from the chat, but selfishly one that troubles me all the time, which is that central government have our money through taxation. And so how much do we say, okay, we're just going to independently do this and use the resources we've got left? And how much do we push, I'm thinking about what you were saying, Carly, about not, letting the state forget that they have a responsibility. I mean, how do we kind of keep pushing the state on that kind of shared resource that they're almost holding back, particularly in the UK, but I imagine in other countries too. So, Carly, I wonder if you just had anything that you might want to kick us off on that.
Yeah, we were talking about this in our breakout group, and what I was saying is that, it's at the end of the day, it's a question of reaching scale, right? The state is still one of the, the key institution that could reach scale. So our creating an alternative is to push it, right? And to demonstrate what can be possible if there's a different arrangement of resources, and we're able to shift and break those monopolies and be able to move to scale in a broad democratic way. So it's to build an alternative is designed to push and designed to transform and not ignore, what the state is doing, what role it plays, but to try to transform that over time, recognizing that we have to build our own power, to be able to move in that particular way and not be, dependent upon it, or have it be something that we're ultimately subject to. So that's kind of what our push and our orientation and engagement with the state is ultimately about.
Thank you. And Tobele, do you think that reflects the way that you're working too? That seems to resonate with what you were saying when you spoke.
Yeah, that does resonate. I think, if we can be showcasing exactly what, like Kelly was saying, showcasing this model, I think already we're starting to get a lot of traction where departments of social development are asking, what are we doing? How are we doing it? And so that's an interesting dynamic for us, because we've got media coming to see what we're doing, and the news coming to report on how this community has been mobilizing themselves. It's started to actually, get the people in the office coming to see what's happening. So that's been interesting, and I really think that's true. And the other thing I have no idea about, but Nick was speaking about it, and another person in our group, Mortia, forget how to pronounce his name, was speaking about a concept of co-budgeting, which was an interesting concept. And I've never heard of it before, but maybe Nick can share a little bit more. I'm putting him on the spot. But I thought it was such a really interesting way of, every year, for example, in South Africa, we have the budget, we have budgets allocated to different municipalities. And how does the community then say how that is, allocated, which was interesting. I think it's something that we could question in our community.
Thank you. Yeah, and that's, I think, Elena, you talked quite a bit about that, about participatory budgeting, so almost modelling how you then kind of devolve down taxpayers' money that you hold as a municipality.
Yeah, sorry, you want me to talk about the participatory budget? And
yeah, it's an example really of how money can be divested out in a democratic way.
Yeah, well, our experience is not really, I mean, it's only at the moment 30 million euros, so this is really not that much. I mean, it's really small part of our budget, and it's kind of an experiment. So I mean, this year, how this could be, decide. And of course, this process began before the pandemic, and it was a pity because we were expecting to have to finish we had some participatory meetings in district to discuss indeed, I mean, which projects should be presented, and so it could not be ended indeed. So, and also the budget was reduced during this month, so we had half the budget. But I think it's interesting to see how, I mean, which projects were voted and which people, I mean, are participating. My concern is that the most voted projects were from issues related with schools, and because the schools and their communities, they mobilize a lot of people, and of course this is positive, of course, that there were a lot of projects related with that, but because they have already a community built. And there were other projects who were really, I think that were really important for the neighborhoods, but I mean, these neighborhoods could not really mobilize. Of course, there was the big challenge of the pandemic, of course, because you could not campaign like that. I mean, there was only the chance to do it online, and this was really a big challenge. But they were not really mobilized, and they were maybe focusing on not maybe, I mean, for sure, focusing in other issues as people losing their jobs and not having maybe in some of the neighborhoods even to eat, because it was like that. I mean, we have big inequalities between neighborhoods, and so yeah, it is quite an experiment to see how people can participate and decide, and of course we'd like to extend it, but it is not the only way to democratize the decision on budget. I mean, this kind of processes, I mean, you can also develop participatory plans related, for instance, we have this Pla de Barris neighborhood plans, so with specific investment for some of the most vulnerable neighborhoods. And so we have discussions, we have discussion groups on the different projects on this plan, and I think this is quite useful to know where to allocate. So we have other experiments, not experiments because these have been developed in the last years. So besides this participatory budgeting through the digital platform that you can develop, no? And of course, always finding ways of finding what people really think that is important for them.
Thank you so much. So I think we need to draw it to a close now, but I have really enjoyed this session. Thank you so much to our speakers. You've been brilliant, and I think some of you put your details in the chat, and and hopefully this conversation can continue both in the UK and then also across internationally too. It feels like we've started something really special, building on all the amazing work that people are already doing. So I'd just like to say thank you as well to Amy and Ruby for working in the background, and to the facilitators from the groups, and Power to Change for funding, and our partners Stonehouse Voice and Plymouth Social Enterprise Network. And hand over to Ed now. Thanks everybody.
Get to unmute myself. Great. Well, thank you all again. We have finally come to the end of the beginning, as Francis says. Hopefully this will sort of kick off other conversations and certainly some new thinking, additional thinking about where we go next. And it's been so great to have you on the journey with us. And of course, our sort of struggle for economic, social and political justice doesn't end here. For many of us, indeed, it is only probably set to intensify. But while this is the end of the series, we will be back in contact over the coming weeks. Stonehouse Voice, our community newspaper friend, has been producing a follow-up publication, which we'll of course share with you along with the recorded edits of the conference. And do not forget to claim your badges, of course, always a bit of fun. In due course, we certainly plan to bring, to create the space, I suppose, to bring people back together. And of course, you can keep in touch and update with all the other activity at Real Ideas and such places by becoming a member, which we encourage you to do, which is free, and details have been dropped in the chat. I suppose that only leaves me to say a huge thank you to you all, and a particular thank you to Tobele, Elena, Callie and Matthew, and of course to Francis, who's been great in terms of moving us through all the questions. I think that's it. Thank you for sticking around. It's been really, really great to see you. Thank you. And until next time, I guess it's going to be bye for now. Goodbye.